Okay, so today we're going to talk about basic electrical concepts. And this is going to relate to membrane potentials, which we'll be talking about both now when we're talking about muscle tissue, and then in the next section when we talk about nervous tissue. So when we're looking at membrane potentials, we're going to be looking at ions moving across the plasma membrane. And when they do that, that will then cause electrical changes to the cell. So some basic electrical concepts that we're going to look at. The first thing that you need to know is that there are two different types of electrical charge. You have positive charge and you have negative charge. So for example, when we're going to be looking at ions, we'll look at sodium and potassium. Those will be positively charged. Chloride is going to be negatively charged. So in the same kind of understanding, we're going to be looking at different areas that are positively charged versus negatively charged. So a positively charged area is just an area that has more positive charges than it has negative charges. And a negatively charged area is going to be an area that has more negative charges than it has positive charges. So what I was talking to you about was like in the election, Elise?
Mm-hmm.
So what I was talking about was during the election how you had a state that would either go Republican or Democratic, and it didn't mean that if a state went Republican that everybody in that state had voted Republican. It just meant that there were more people that voted Republican, and so that state was considered Republican. So, and then they would put, a color up for that state being Republican. So, same thing here. If you have a positively charged area, it doesn't mean that every single charge in that area is positive. It just means that there are more positives than there are negatives. So it's called then a positively charged area. And if an area is charged, you can also call it polarized. So charged and polarized in this respect, we're just saying are about the same thing. So the next thing to know about charges is that like charges repel one another. So if we look here, kind of at the beads that I brought here, so say that these two are like charges because they're both blue, okay? So, and here is a different charge. So we can say that the blue charges, these blue beads here, are going to represent chloride, okay? And chloride is negative. So here's one chloride, here's another chloride. They're both negative, so they are repelled by one another. They don't want to be next to each other. They're like, oh, gross, you're negative. Get away from me. Whereas opposite charges attract one another. So have you ever heard like opposites attract? There's a saying like opposites attract. So if you have here, this is a positive charge. Here's the negative charge. They're attracted to one another, okay? So they're like, oh, you look good, okay? And so they want to get together. And that attraction between each other actually causes a force to occur between them. So there's a force between the opposites. So between those two there would be a force. So what is this force determined by? Well, the first thing is, so if you look at what's written right here, if you have more charge, you're going to have a greater force. So the greater the charge, the greater the amount of force that you're going to have. And the second thing is, the shorter the distance, the greater the force that you're going to have. Okay? So what we're saying here is that if we have these two charges, and here they're close to each other, they're actually going to have a greater force. They're going to be more attracted to each other the closer they are. If you cause them to be further apart, then they're not as attracted to each other. So you've made the distance greater, and that would make the force go down. So it's like, have you heard of distance makes the heart grow fonder? Have you ever heard of that saying? Well, apparently there's a saying, like distance makes the heart grow fonder. So like if you're further apart, you are like, I miss you so much. So what we're saying here is it's not like that. Distance actually makes them not as fond of each other, okay? So they want to get together, and the closer they are, the greater the force of attraction is. So that's what they're saying right here, okay? So to separate positive charge from negative charge because they want to get together so badly, they want to be together. If you separate them from each other, it's actually going to require energy to do that. So energy is required to separate positive from negative charge. And when you allow the positive and the negative to come together, so once they are able to come together, energy actually gets released. And with the energy that gets released from allowing these two charges to get together, then work can be done. So the cell can actually do some work with that energy. So, therefore, when positive and negative charges are separated from one another, so when we keep the positive and negative charge separated from one another, they have the potential to perform work. So right now they're not actually doing any work because they haven't been allowed to get together. Energy isn't released at that point. And so they aren't doing any work, but here they are separated from each other and they have the potential to perform work. So have you ever heard of somebody saying, you have a lot of potential? Have you ever heard that? Oh, she has a lot of potential, or he has a lot of potential. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, wow, you have so much potential. But what that means is that you're not doing anything. You're not doing anything. Like, you could do a lot of stuff if you try, but basically you're not doing anything. So like you're lazy, kind of. But here, that's what this is saying. They have potential, but that means they're not actually doing any work.
Potential and kinetic energy.
Yeah. So potential energy, is it actually doing anything?
No, but when it's kinetic, it just like moves.
Right.
And does work.
So this is potential energy that's not doing anything, but it has the potential to do something. And then once energy gets released, then you get work happening. So voltage, and that's designated by a big E, is the measure of this potential. So the measure of the potential of this charge being separated from one another is called the voltage. And volts is the units of this measurement. And it's measured between 2 points in a system. So what we're going to be looking at, so I'll pull this over here. So can you see that sheet there? Is there enough light? Or do I need to bring this other paper? Do you see that better? Is that better? See this little figure right here? That's supposed to be a cell. And this is the plasma membrane, here in red. And that's separating the inside of the cell, and the inside of the cell is the intracellular fluid, from the outside of the cell, which is the extracellular fluid. And those are the two areas that we're interested in, what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at is the voltage that is going to be between the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid right across the plasma membrane. Those are going to be the 2 points. Now, current, which is designated by a capital I don't know where they get these letters from, but I'm sure there's a reason, and maybe I learned it, but I can't remember, is the actual movement or flow of electrical charge from one point to another. So when the charge is actually allowed to move, then you have current. And current is dependent on the voltage. So remember what we talked about? You have the voltage here, which was keeping these two separate. You had energy required, which was measured as voltage. And so if you actually now allow the charge to move, that would be current. And that current is dependent on how much voltage you have and how much resistance you have between the 2 points, so between the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid. And this is designated by what's called Ohm's law. So this, I guess he was a physicist or something like that. He decided to make up this law, and he said current is equal to voltage divided by resistance. Okay, so that's the equation. So if you look at that equation, what can you tell me about current? What would happen if you'd make the voltage, which is designated by E, bigger? What would happen to the current? So the voltage is that in the numerator or in the denominator?
Numerator.
Right, so the voltage is in the numerator. So if you'd make this bigger, would the current get bigger too?
Yeah.
What would happen? What about resistance? Is that in the numerator or the denominator?
Denominator.
So if you'd make that bigger, what would happen to the current? It would get
Smaller.
right. Okay, and that makes sense because resistance means that it's resisting the movement of the charge. So the more resistance you have, the less current you're going to have. So that's what this is saying here. When resistance is constant, if you increase the voltage, then the current is going to increase. And when you have the voltage constant, if you increase the resistance, then the current is actually going to decrease. Okay? So we're going to see how that all relates to the charge across the plasma membrane when we're looking at a neuron and when we're looking at a muscle cell.